They said the smoke over St. Agnes Parish clung like memory. For 3 days after the blaze, the horizon carried a dull bruise of gray, and the air tasted of iron. When Reverend Ezra Cobb arrived on horseback that January morning of 1897, he found the de Lafayette plantation gates yawning open. The vines around them twitched in the wind as though still afraid. Inside, the grounds were ruined but not destroyed. Roses burned to wire, statues cracked like eggshells, the sugar fields rippling with ash. The mansion itself impossibly still stood white and perfect. Only the chapel was gone. Cobb dismounted, knelt beside the blackened foundation, and saw that the crucifix had melted into the floorboards, leaving the faint outline of a man with arms outstretched. He thought at first it was an accident, some candle left burning through the sermon. Then he noticed the hoof prints circling the ruin, bare human feet pressed among them, moving in a spiral that ended at the threshold. In the soot above the lintel someone had carved a name with a steady hand, Moses de Lafayette. No one in the parish remembered such a man, yet old records hinted that before the war there had been a slave by that name, one who vanished after a murder no one dared record. Cobb turned his eyes to the sky, but even the birds refused to cross above that land. Later he would tell the sheriff that when he whispered a prayer, the wind answered back in a low humming voice, almost grateful that he had finally come to look. The courthouse in Baton Rouge smells of mildew and ink. Inside a warped ledger, dated 1821, there's a single entry under property of Colonel Armand de Lafayette, Moses, male Negro born of no known mother. Purchased 1836. Noted for silence. That silence, it seems, followed him through the decades. A second entry, added in a different hand, marks him freed, 1865. Then the handwriting trembles, ink darker, as if pressed harder than the quill could bear, and continues, reappeared, 1874. Property of self. The clerk's margin note is almost illegible. He came back wearing the master's signet ring. Historians later found the old plantation records full of gaps, tax papers missing, death certificates unsigned. What they could trace was rumor. The colonel was found dead in his study in 1866, throat slit by a straight razor kept for trimming the sermons he carved into his slaves' backs. The man who buried him was Moses, his former servant, his shadow. No trial, no witnesses. The body laid to rest under a live oak without priest or scripture. Weeks later, the colonel's widow, Celeste, announced her remarriage. To that same man, the parish froze in disbelief. A black man owning de Lafayette land in post-war Louisiana was unthinkable. Yet the deed bore his name, signed and sealed by a trembling magistrate who resigned soon after. The church refused to bless the union, but the widow insisted. She claimed the Lord himself had spoken to her in the charred stillness of her husband's study, telling her, "The past is only a mouth that must be fed." No one knew what that meant. No one asked. It happened on a moonless July night in 1867, remembered by locals as the Sin Wedding. Guests came out of fear, not celebration, both black and white, bound by curiosity and debt. They said Moses wore a suit of gray linen that didn't belong to him. Celeste, pale and trembling, clutched a bouquet of oleander. The priest had refused, so a field hand read verses from an old psalter whose pages were stuck with dried blood. The ceremony took place in the courtyard beneath the iron balconies. Fireflies hovered thick as dust. When the couple exchanged vows, thunder rolled though no storm followed. At the reception, no one could recall what they ate. Some said the stew tasted sweet like sugarcane. Others swore it was salted with tears. A fiddler played hymns backward, strings snapping one by one. Just before midnight, Celeste raised her glass for a toast. The crystal split in her hand, slicing deep. Blood fell into Moses's wine. Without hesitation, he drank. The witnesses later remembered the moment as endless, like the air paused to watch. Then came a sound, low and human, yet too many throats to count. The guests turned to the garden and saw shapes between the magnolias, figures blacker than night, standing still, as if waiting to be acknowledged. By morning, half the guests had gone home and the other half refused to speak of it. Within a week, every one of them reported the same dream. Chains made of bone stretching from the chapel ruins down into the soil, rattling softly beneath their beds. The years that followed brought prosperity too swift to be natural. Sugar yields doubled, soil rich where it once refused seed. Some called it divine blessing. Others whispered that nothing grows so fast without blood beneath it. By 1871, the plantation was reborn, its fields gold with harvest, its workers paid and housed. Yet strange things marked the nights. Livestock found standing rigid in the dawn, eyes wide, tongues black. A child gone missing near the cypress grove, later discovered at the riverbank, humming a tune none could name. When the sheriff asked Moses about it, the man only smiled and said, "The land remembers kindness." The chapel, burned long ago, remained untouched by his order. "A scar must stay open," he told the workers. At sundown, travelers on the bayou reported lights flickering there, first like lanterns, then like eyes. Some nights the river swelled with sound, a hymn with no words, sung in voices layered and low. Old women said that those who listened too long began to walk toward the sound, even in their sleep. They would wake halfway submerged, water lapping at their chins, whispering something in tongues forgotten by men. When a priest from New Orleans came to bless the fields, he collapsed upon crossing the gate. Witnesses swore the soil smoked where his holy water fell. He awoke screaming of roots that pulsed like veins. He was carried out and never returned. The mansion, meanwhile, stood quiet, its windows dark as mirrors, and behind those mirrors some claimed the reflections lagged, faces turning just a moment too late, as if someone else were watching from within. Celeste de Lafayette's last months were spent confined to the upper rooms. Her voice, once commanding, softened to a whisper no one could fully hear. Servants said she spoke to someone unseen, often in the burned chapel's direction. In July of 1883, fevered and half delirious, she summoned the parish priest and demanded he write her words. The letter, sealed and forgotten until 1939, remains among the archives of St. Agnes. Its contents were unsettling, even by the standards of legend. Celeste wrote of an exchange. She claimed Moses purchased his freedom not with gold, but with remembrance. That the night he killed her husband, the air turned to glass and something stepped through it. It had no face, she wrote, only a reflection of my own grief, and it spoke in the voice of my prayers. She confessed that when Moses looked at her afterward, his eyes no longer belonged to the man she'd known. They were endless, patient, old. He asked me to be his bride, she said, but what I married was not Moses. It was what he had awakened. The final paragraph trails off mid-sentence, ink smeared by what might have been tears, or something wetter. The chapel hums again. It is calling him home. When the priest returned to her room the next morning, Celeste was gone, the door locked from within, her chair still rocking. Only the faint smell of smoke remained, and on the floor by the open window, ash in the shape of 2 bare feet. By the time the century turned, those who had known Moses began to notice he had not aged. His beard whitened, but his eyes, deep, fixed, and lucid, seemed untouched by time. Children born on his land grew old, left, and died. But Moses walked the fields with the same even stride, the same heavy silence. Some called him blessed, others whispered rooted, like a tree that could not die because it had fed too long on the blood beneath. In 1902, a census taker came through St. Agnes. His log lists Moses de Lafayette as 51 years of age, but an older entry from 1850 records him as 24. The numbers did not align. When the clerk returned to correct the record, he found the census taker drowned in his own well, eyes open, mouth filled with black soil. By then, no one dared approach the plantation after sundown. The workers kept to daylight hours, leaving before the shadows lengthened. They claimed Moses spoke to the soil itself, kneeling in the fields at dusk, whispering in a language too slow to catch. On nights of heavy rain, they heard the ground breathing the air pushed out of the wet earth in rhythmic sighs, as if something vast and buried turned beneath it. When asked why he remained on cursed land, Moses replied only once, "Because the Lord gave me the keys, and the door won't stay shut." No one knew what door he meant. but the humming from the ruined chapel was said to grow louder each year, like a memory learning to speak. In 1908, a flood swept through the parish, washing away the de Lafayette Chapel's remains. The water revealed the stone foundations, still warm to the touch despite the cold. When the river receded, Moses ordered an orphanage built upon the site, the St. Agnes Home for Colored Children. It opened with fanfare, donations from distant philanthropists, and praise from the church. Yet the locals called it the second chapel. Within its first year, 4 children vanished. The matron insisted they'd been sent to relatives up north. But no records of departure exist. Other children whispered of voices under the floorboards, calling their names softly at night, asking if they wanted to remember. An investigator from Baton Rouge visited after a nun reported seeing a boy walk through a wall like candle smoke. His notes, found decades later, describe strange carvings under the orphanage cellar, spirals of script resembling no language known to man, but each spiral centered on a single word, Moses. He wrote of hearing humming, low and rhythmic, when he pressed his ear to the floor. It stopped only when he spoke the name aloud. Weeks later, the orphanage burned during a thunderstorm that struck no other building. All 31 children perished inside. Their bodies were found seated in rows, hands folded as if in prayer. No signs of struggle. Their eyes had turned a milky white, as though they'd been staring into the sun. Moses, standing barefoot in the rain, said only, "They've gone to help me tend the field." The sheriff did not arrest him. He simply quit, left the county, and was never seen again. In 1914, a traveling photographer named Henry Wills came to St. Agnes to document haunted grounds of the South. He arrived skeptical, confident in his new invention, glass, late negatives coated in silver bromide, said to capture what the eye could not. He took 6 photographs of the de Lafayette property. 5 were ruined by fogging. The 6th of the ruined mansion facade survived. When developed, it showed Moses standing in the foreground, perfectly clear despite the 30-yard distance. Behind him, in the reflection of the windows, were dozens of pale figures. They were facing inward toward him. Wills sent the plate to the Louisiana Chronicle, which refused to print it. The editor wrote a private letter, now preserved in archives. "The image is impossible. If true, it proves what our faith cannot." Weeks later, Wills vanished. His darkroom assistant claimed he'd begun to behave strangely, locking himself in, mumbling that the light won't stop bending. The assistant last saw him near the river, camera tripod slung over his shoulder, walking toward the orphanage ruins. He never returned. When the authorities searched his studio, they found hundreds of shattered plates, all bearing the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass from inside. For years afterward, collectors whispered about a cursed negative said to show the living among the dead. Some say it still exists, buried in a New Orleans archive mislabeled as weather damage, 1914. Those who have searched for it report the same thing, a humming, like film catching fire in slow motion, whenever they approach the sealed box. By 1925, St. Agnes Parish had become a ghost town. The church bell rang without rope. The last store closed after its owner was found sitting upright at the counter, eyes open, heart stopped, mouth filled with ashes. Maps began to omit the area altogether, as if it had never been. Letters sent there returned unopened, marked no such parish. And yet, the postmaster's log recorded someone collecting mail weekly, signed simply Moses. Historians say collective memory is fragile, but what happened in St. Agnes was something else. Families who'd lived there for generations could no longer recall their own names. Birth certificates, property deeds, all blank where the parish should have been written. It was as though the town had been erased not from history, but from language itself. In 1927, a journalist from Chicago tried to locate it. He drove south through empty fields, followed the Mississippi until the road dissolved into dust. Then suddenly he found himself before an iron gate, half wallowed by vines, engraved with a single word, "Remember." When he asked locals in the next county, they insisted no such gate existed. He left unnerved. Weeks later, his editors received his final telegram. "I heard the hymn. I think I understand now. The land is awake." He was never heard from again. His car was discovered near a bayou, engine running, driver's door open. seat covered in fine gray ash. In 1933, workers restoring the old plantation house unearthed something beneath the chapel foundation, a hollow chamber lined with cedar. Inside were dozens of human jawbones arranged in a perfect circle. In the center lay a book bound in skin, its pages blank except for one. Written there, in the same looping script as the parish ledgers, were 9 words: "He who remembers shall inherit the house of dust." The workers sealed the chamber and fled. That night, the mansion's caretaker heard footsteps pacing above his room, though he was alone. Then a voice, deep, deliberate, familiar, began to recite from somewhere within the walls. The caretaker described it later as a sermon, but preached from under the floor. He left by dawn, his hair turned white. The next morning, the house stood silent. The book had vanished. Only the circle of jawbones remained, each now marked with a name carved inside the bone, the names of every worker who'd been there the day before. When questioned, Moses, still alive and unchanged, only said, "They were promised remembrance. It is a heavy gift." The following winter, the last of the workers' families left the parish. The plantation fell into ruin again, its fields returning to swamp. But those who pass the area even today report hearing faint preaching from underground, a voice older than the land, speaking of debts no grave can bury. In 1939, a Works Progress Administration historian named Alma Keene was assigned to collect Negro folklore of the Deep South. She expected tales of hauntings and hymns. What she found in the St. Agnes records made her hands shake. Among the parish deeds lay a folder marked only MD1, typewritten federal property. Inside, photocopies of an 1865 military order, unsigned reports from Freedmen's Bureau agents, and a memorandum stamped classified until 1955. The earliest document described an individual named Moses D. L. F., displaying unaccountable familiarity with death dates of local whites. Another report claimed the man refuses Christian rites, speaks to the soil, predicts storms with precision. The files referred to him not as citizen, but as Subject 13. Keene's field journal, preserved in the Library of Congress, tells what happened next. She drove to the coordinates listed in the file and found no parish, only cypress and drowned gravestones. Yet her compass spun violently, and her car radio hummed with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. When she turned the dial, a voice whispered, "You came to record, now you will remember." She fled that night and mailed the folder to her supervisor in Baton Rouge. He received it empty, every page gone, replaced by thin gray dust. 3 days later, Keene was found in her boarding house room, seated upright, notebook open to a single sentence. He was never a man. He was the echo that sin left behind. The project was quietly dissolved. St. Agnes was struck from future surveys. No one spoke of File MD1 again. In 1941, during the cataloging of regional art at Chilean University, restorers uncovered an unsigned portrait of Celeste de Lafayette. At first glance, the painting seemed ordinary, Victorian composition, pale woman in white silk. But under infrared analysis, another figure emerged behind her, a shadow shaped like a man, its face painted over in a later layer. Closer inspection showed the pigment beneath pulsing faintly under light, as if wet. The restoration team noted a strange smell of molasses and smoke. One student, curious, scraped a flake of paint into a vial. That night he began screaming that the eyes are opening. He clawed his own eyelids until restrained. The vial was tested. The pigment contained human hemoglobin and traces of marsh soil. Art historians concluded the piece was an early work of the so-called Bayou iconographer, a painter rumored to mix blood into his oils, but the canvas frame bore a carved signature MDL F. When the dean ordered the portrait destroyed, the furnace failed. The flames would not take it. Finally, they sealed the painting in a storage vault beneath the university chapel. To this day, the vault's humidity sensors register rhythmic fluctuations, 60 beats per minute, precisely the rate of a human heart. Locals say if you stand above that chapel during midnight mass, you can hear soft weeping from the ground below. followed by a whisper asking, "Do you remember her?" The following year, a Jesuit archivist named Father Lucian Morneau submitted a letter to his superiors marked confidential, do not print. He claimed to have visited the ruins of St. Agnes at Moses's invitation. In his account, the old man appeared unaged, skin smooth, voice deep as wind in the reeds. Morneau wrote that Moses led him to the swamp edge where the chapel once stood. There the ground had split open, revealing stairs descending into darkness. By lantern light, the priest saw walls carved with names, thousands overlapping, repeating his own among them. At the base lay an altar of black salt. Upon it rested a heart still beating, though detached from any body. Moses said it was memory itself. The priest wrote, "He told me each generation forgets the pain that births it. He was chosen to keep that pain alive, to be the vessel of the unforgotten." The next passage is blotted by water damage, but one line remains clear. He asked if I would take it from him. I said no. He wept like thunder. Father Morneau returned to New Orleans a week later and renounced his vows. His hair had turned completely white. He spent his remaining days carving spirals into church pews, whispering the same phrase over and over. The wound must stay open. His superiors sealed the letter and ordered it buried in the seminary vault. It was rediscovered only in 1972, the ink still damp to the touch. In 1947, a major hurricane struck southern Louisiana. Reporters sent by Paramount News filmed the aftermath from the air. One reel, archived as storm-damaged St. Agnes area, shows an impossible scene, the floodwater receding backward, as if time reversed, revealing the outline of fields arranged in a perfect spiral. When projected at normal speed, a faint chanting can be heard beneath the wind, a choir of hundreds singing in a deep minor key. Audio engineers insist the frequency pattern matches human speech recorded backward. The cameraman, Thomas Vail, filed a statement before taking ill. The man was standing in the eye of the storm, untouched. He looked up and smiled. The footage cuts off as lightning strikes near the lens. Vail died 3 days later from an infection no doctor could name. His blood reportedly clotted black on contact with air. The reel was confiscated by federal authorities, returned decades later without sound. Yet projectionists claim that if the film jams or slows, the chant returns, growing clearer each time, syllables forming one word, remember. Meteorologists cite atmospheric distortion. Historians call it coincidence. But locals swear that after that hurricane, the bayou's tides began to breathe. Water flowing in and out with the rhythm of a sleeper's chest, as though something beneath was dreaming again. By 1950, few dared speak the name Moses de Lafayette. Yet census data from that year lists 3 new residents of the abandoned parish. All infants registered under that surname. No parents recorded. No birth certificates issued anywhere else in the state. Doctors from Baton Rouge who examined the babies noted unusual features. Identical gray irises, faint scars around the throat as though from a cord at birth, and an ability to hum perfectly in tune within hours of delivery. The hospital staff nicknamed them the Triplets of Remembrance. Before the state could transfer them to an orphanage, the infants disappeared. A nurse claimed she saw a tall man in a gray suit carrying them toward the river at dawn. She tried to follow but found herself frozen, ears ringing with a low vibration that made her teeth ache. When she blinked, they were gone. That night, fishermen on the Mississippi reported lights moving beneath the surface. 3 small orbs drifting upstream against the current. Each glowed brighter as thunder rolled over the delta. Weeks later, fresh growth appeared across the ruined fields of St. Agnes. Grass where none had grown for decades. Birds returned. And at the property's center, new foundations rose on their own, as if the earth had begun to rebuild what it once destroyed. No one has since located those children. But in old recordings from the period, a lullaby can be faintly heard on regional radio frequencies. A woman's voice singing to unseen listeners, "Sleep, little memory, sleep till I call. The field is your cradle, the river your wall." In 1951, Baton Rouge radio station WQBR began airing a late-night program called Echoes of the South. It featured field recordings of forgotten hymns collected from rural parishes. On August 3rd, midway through broadcast, listeners reported a sudden cut in transmission. followed by a sustained low hum. The sound lasted exactly 13 minutes. Technicians swore they hadn't touched the switchboard. When they replayed the recording, the tape had changed. The hymns were gone, replaced by a single male voice speaking slowly in a dialect no one recognized. Linguists who examined it years later described the speech as Anglo-Creole reversed through itself. A pattern mathematically recursive, impossible for a human mouth to form. But one word could be isolated when reversed: Moses. Shortly after, every engineer present during that broadcast resigned within a week. Two later committed suicide, leaving notes that read, "He's teaching us to remember." The station buried the reel in a locked vault. Decades later, in a 1978 renovation, the reel was found blank. No magnetism left in the tape, as if the sound had consumed its own memory. Yet, when the archivist set it aside, he noticed his hands were black with residue that smelled faintly of river mud. Some nights, according to the janitorial staff, the studio still hums around 2:00 a.m., exactly 13 minutes long. On certain frequencies, the hum synchronizes with the pulse of the Mississippi tide. Breathing in, breathing out. The engineers used to call it the Lord's static. Locals who remember the story call it Moses praying. In 1952, a drought dropped the Mississippi to its lowest level in half a century. Near St. Agnes, river mud cracked open like old lips, revealing foundations long buried. Among them, brick columns, remnants of a dock, and bones thousands, all small. Forensic teams assumed they were animal remains until they found rosary beads, baby teeth, and buttons the size of a child's thumb. The bones were arranged in spirals, perfectly symmetrical, each spiral pointing toward a mound of blackened stone, the last piece of the de Lafayette Chapel. One photograph, later suppressed, captured something else: the faint imprint of footprints circling the mound, pressed deep but perfectly preserved, though no person had walked there in decades. Witnesses said that as the sun set, the ground began to tremble. A noise rose from the bones like distant thunder, 1,000 breaths exhaled together. When the river finally swelled again that night, it covered the site within minutes, as though the water had been waiting for permission to return. The following morning, the excavation team was gone. Their tents, equipment, and notes remained, but not a trace of the men. Locals saw no tracks leading away, only ripples in the mud shaped like open hands. The government declared the area restricted for hydrological safety. To this day, fishermen refuse to cast lines near that bend in the river. They say the current there doesn't move with the others. It circles slowly inward, like water remembering where to go. In 1955, archivist James E. Porter received a package with no return address. Inside lay a single photograph of Moses de Lafayette, dated 1857. On the back, in faint graphite, "You forgot me." Porter logged the artifact and stored it in the restricted section of the Louisiana State Archive. That night, he dreamt he was standing in a flooded church. Beneath the water, pale faces stared upward, mouths moving in slow harmony. One rose from the depth. Moses' eyes calm, voice echoing like the current. "You keep us in paper, but paper burns. Will you keep us in blood?" He woke to find his hands streaked with mud and his typewriter still tapping by itself, each letter striking the same word again and again: remember. The next morning, the photograph was gone. In its place lay a piece of glass, cracked, smelling faintly of iron. His colleagues later found Porter standing in the archive stacks, head tilted as though listening. When asked what he heard, he said, "The ink is humming." He was committed to a sanitarium soon after, where he spent the remainder of his life writing in reverse script across the walls of his room. The message, when mirrored, reads, "Memory is not a gift, it is a mouth, and it must be fed." Witness accounts from 1957 speak of a man seen walking the levee road outside St. Agnes at dusk. Tall, gray suit, bare feet. Locals described him as too still, the air around him strangely quiet. When cars passed, their radios crackled into static. Drivers reported feeling a pressure behind their eyes, a sudden flood of memories, faces of strangers, songs from childhood, smells of rain long forgotten. One farmer claimed he spoke with the man, said his voice sounded like earth turning. The man asked only one question: "What will you give to be remembered?" Within a month, the farmer's house burned down, his fields bloomed unnaturally bright, and his newborn grandson was born with gray eyes. The townspeople stopped speaking of it. The parish, still unmarked on modern maps, fell silent again. But freight captains passing the bayou began reporting lights moving through the mist. Sometimes a tall figure stood at the river edge, motionless, facing the water. When lightning flashed, his reflection showed him still standing there, but facing outward toward them. They say the humming never stopped after that summer. It simply changed pitch, rising like a song that has finally remembered its words. In 1960, surveyors mapping the floodplain photographed an expanse of tall grass where St. Agnes once stood. The image revealed faint geometric lines in the vegetation, dozens of spirals converging into one vast circle, half a mile wide. When the team walked the site, their instruments malfunctioned. The air buzzed faintly, metallic, like the aftertaste of lightning. At the circle's center, they found a single iron plaque emerging from the soil, untarnished by time. No dates, no symbols, only words deeply etched. Here lies everyone who remembered. No further investigation followed. The area was declared unstable and flooded intentionally for levee expansion. Yet the satellite photos still show, beneath the water, the same pattern glowing faintly through the silt. Locals say that when storms roll over Louisiana, the wind carries a low hum, steady as breath. Those who listen closely claim to hear two voices overlapping, one male, one female, whispering in unison, "The field is awake, the door is open." And in that whisper, if you listen long enough, another sound emerges, soft, rhythmic, almost kind. The sound of someone gently knocking from the other side. Moses the legend, the slave who killed his master, married the widow, and became a plantation owner, a story of remembrance, corruption, and the wound that will not close.